And we're live. Welcome to episode 5 of Choss Chats. I'm here with Settlers Lament, and we're going to be joined by Baron von Blau, aka the Blue Baron. Very briefly, he has a little bit of he has some IRL stuff that he needs to finish before he can actually join the stream. But he's I mean, I think he's been around for a while, but he's a good guy, and he'll get here eventually. In the meanwhile, Settler and I are going to go over the early first British Empire, get into the Victorians a little bit, and then really hammer home what happened during the post-colonial period, because Settler over here is apparently an expert on how Rhodesia did absolutely nothing wrong. Is that correct, sir?
That's not how I would portray it per se. But no, I know a fair bit about Rhodesian history and the British Empire in general. I mean, honestly, when we're talking about societies like 50 years or more in the past, I find it utterly redundant to moralize. I just find certain things interesting and certain things not interesting. Yeah, I'm Settlers Lament. Most of you probably know me. If you don't, you should subscribe. But why is this called Choss Chats? Like, what does that mean?
Well,
I thought it was Closs Chats.
Name's Clossington, but Choss is it's actually a geotechnical term for or it's a term used by rock climbers to describe really unstable rock, like corroded, molded over rock that will just collapse in on itself. And I feel like the tenuous nature of this live stream kind of reflects what Choss is. So,
Okay.
and it's also somewhat similar to Kloss or Clossington. So, yeah, that's why it's called Choss Chats. Everybody, the more you know.
Okay.
So, the first British Empire from 1560 or 1583 to 1783, it's largely defined by settlement in the 13 colonies, Canada, the Bahamas, Belize, and Jamaica. So just taking over, settling the Caribbean and establishing plantations in the South and colonies, like merchant colonies in the 13 colonies, and fur trade in Canada. I mean, I'm not nearly as familiar with Canadian colonial history as Settlers Lament, but I mean, I guess for our American viewers, could you give something of a brief synopsis of what happened with Canada's early colonial history, Settler, as a proud Canuck yourself?
Yeah. I suppose the first thing to go over is that historians nowadays, from what I understand, don't even really like the term First and Second British Empire. For those of you who are unaware, Clossington kind of explained it, but just to be clear, in layman's terms, the First British Empire refers to basically before the end of the American Revolution, all the stuff the British Empire did before that. And the Second British Empire refers to all the stuff after the American Revolution. So the end of the 1700s and the 1800s, all the way up until, like, I don't know, the fall of Hong Kong or something, depending on when exactly you draw that line. But I don't know.
To point to the Suez Canal crisis as like the official end. Like I also like to kind of separate. I mean, there's the First Empire where you're colonizing the Americas and a little bit of India, and then America breaks off. And then you have sort of the Victorian era, but I like to draw like something of a line between, I guess, the early Second Empire and the later sort of new imperial protectorate sort of model that was really popular in like the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. You know, with British protectorates in Africa.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
But no, I mean, I'm not totally sure why historians don't really like the sort of the terms First and Second British Empire anymore. I don't know. I generally expect it's just because they're left wingers and they think it's racist or something for some reason. But you know, who knows? I know the main answer I've gotten from I've generally heard is just that they think it's overly simplistic or something. Which I mean, that's more or less true. All models are the reason models exist is to simplify a concept. That doesn't mean that the model is necessarily bad, but that discussion's a bit beyond this. I just wanted to get that out there and make it kind of clear what those terms mean. But yeah, Canada. I'm certainly not an expert on Canadian history, though I certainly know a bit. But for this first period, we're talking about the first British Empire. There isn't actually as much British involvement in Canada. The sort of Canada that we think of when we think of Canada, well, maybe not the Canada we think of right now, not the like Justin Trudeau gay pride flag Canada, but the sort of like the Canada that is represented in my profile picture. That is kind of a post-American Revolution thing. Not totally. Places like Newfoundland had been a part of the British Empire since 1583. I think I'm pretty sure.
Something like that.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, after the American Revolution, a ton of American loyalists to the British Empire migrated north to Canada to seek refuge under the colonies, under
Yes.
the protectorate status of the good old empire.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, they made a huge mistake based on how absolutely cucked your country is, but I digress.
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing I will maintain very solidly. Canada until the 1960s was more right wing than America, but that's beside.
That's a story for another day. Like I'm actually going to hit hard on the Quiet Revolution in my next Dissidents Against the Modern World, and I was absolutely blown away by the absolute debauchery that went on and the complete collapse.
Yeah, I'm still not totally sure how that possibly happened.
Elvis.
Yeah.
Don't. Yeah. It's.
But no. But okay. So that's all besides the point. Just again, the brief overview of Canadian history. So yeah, like we were both saying, the Canada that's represented in my profile picture wasn't much of a thing until after the American Revolution. Exactly why Clossington said, because a bunch of loyalists left from America and went north and settled in mainly Ontario, though other parts of Canada too. And that land had been taken off the French about 10 years before that in the, I think Americans call it the French Indian War. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War.
Yeah. The 7 Years' War is what I always heard it called, but I think Americans call it the French Indian War for some reason. But yeah, so that's when like Ontario, what today is Ontario and Quebec, and some other parts of what is today Canada were taken off of the French, I believe Ontario was, I'm almost certain Ontario was mostly French settlers until after the American Revolution. And then all those loyalists were settled there, and it became an Anglo colony since then. And the motto of Ontario to this day is actually "Loyal she began, loyal she remains," which is a reference to that whole thing. But yeah, so that's sort of, so yeah, Canada was something that I kind of say sometimes, which I think's disgusting, and I don't actually believe, but I know I'm really surprised why left wingers don't say this in Canada more. Is that our country was literally founded by refugees. But
no, that's sort of like the ethos that Ireland is running under right now. Freedom from Britain. Let's embrace all the other oppressed peoples who were subjugated by Britain. Let in all of the poor refugees of the world.
Yeah.
It seems more masochistic and harmful than useful.
Yeah.
But it's something like Trudeau would probably say. I don't know. So the good old 13 colonies, they were originally founded by a bunch of joint stock companies who were trying to seek a profit by planting a bunch of poor people in the north, and poor Scots, Irish kind of serf slave peasants, in the South to pick to help grow tobacco and indigo and yada yada yada. None of these ventures were actually profitable, but I mean, was at least the Hudson Bay Company profitable in Canada, or was that just another dud? Is that like,
I'm honestly not massively familiar with the economic history of Canada. Um, I am more familiar with the economic history of the East India Company, if you want to talk about that. But no, I mean, I know fur trade was like the reason French settlers were here in the first place.
mm-hmm.
I imagine it must have. The Hudson's Bay Company, of course, wasn't French, but still, I imagine it must have been profitable if there were, if like our entire country was founded because of a fashion trend. But I'm not totally familiar with the economic history of it to know how profitable it was exactly.
Hmm. I mean, we can just I guess brush over the Americas because of how loosely Britain held control over Canada and how loosely they maintained the Bahamas and Jamaica, and go over the I guess the British East India Company, because that is one hell of a topic.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, as I'm sure you guys are more or less aware. For until 1857, I believe, if I'm getting the date right, I'm pretty sure I am. The East India Company is what held the British parts of India, not like the crown directly or anything. Um, and there was and they slowly expanded throughout India, and it didn't. The European involvement in India generally was a very long process. When it's easy to look at colonization retroactively, and imagine when Europeans first set foot in India or somewhere like that they were expecting they were going to conquer everything, but that's a very ahistorical way of looking at it. People just showed up because they wanted to like trade some stuff and make some money. And over the course of like 100, 200 years, it slowly evolved into like conquering an entire continent.
Like
Um,
if I could kind of expand upon that, um, the most expansive history I've actually read of the Indian imperialist project is I read a massive brick of a book called The Chaos of Empire, the British Raj, and the Conquest of India. It is revisionist garbage. Whatever you do, don't read this. But it did give some decent insight into, I guess, a play-by-play of what happened. And what what kind of surprised me was what the British Empire or British East India Company was up to. Like they originally settled established kind of like a fort factory in Calcutta and Bombay, and what they got up to was, I mean, it wasn't exactly a factory. It was more just a bunch of workers and artisans producing goods that would be shipped over to Britain. But uh, what was that massive battle in this mid 1700s that solidified the East India Company on the continent? Um, did I forget what it was called? But so slowly the British kicked out the French interests in India. Like if I remember correctly, there was also like a Swedish and a Dutch. I mean, not Swedish and Dutch, like a Swedish and Danish outpost on India. But that's, I don't know. It was a really weird project of just kicking out all of the other interests. Settler mentioned before we started that apparently the Portuguese still held on to Goa into the 1960s, which
yeah, I think it was 1960 exactly when the Indians seized it.
Yeah.
And it had been a Portuguese province specifically was the legal term they would use until the or state, maybe, I'm not sure. What I mean when I say specifically legal term, I can't remember exactly what the specific legal term is, but in the 1900s, the Portuguese did not consider Angola or Mozambique or go to be colonies. They considered them to be parts of Portugal. The sort of state ideology on the matter was that Portugal was a multi-continental country.
Mm.
But yeah, so the Indians seized it in, I believe, 1960, if I'm getting the year right.
Something like that. So with regards to sort of the African and Asian empires, or portions of the British Empire, you had on the continent of Africa, you had, I guess, stations where slaves were extracted and brought to the more profitable colonies in the Caribbean. But then you had something like slow infiltration of missionaries and traders. The book Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe is I really like the book, but it really depicts how Christianity kind of got its hooks into, I guess, the more feminine, weak-willed, non-traditional segments of the Nigerian population in sort of a biolenist manner, if I recall correctly. But meanwhile, in India, you had the British sinking its hooks into these profitable factories and having their Mick armies take over portions of India and coastal cities, and then slowly flip princes into quasi protectorates, princedoms into quasi protectorates, and then you had the Australian prison colonies, and you had the massive fights between the colonists and Maori of New Zealand. But it's a massive endeavor that the British went on in the 19th century. I'm not quite sure how to break it down, really.
Yeah. I guess just to give a bit more details on the East India Company, is what a lot of people probably know them from is the opium smuggling into into China, which I've read several books and articles and stuff on that. So I'll save you the whole history, but to give sort of the basics of that. Sorry, I'm getting a call.
Well, I guess Settlers dealing with that.
Sorry, I just told them to screw off.
Great. I'm actually very flattered.
No, it's
Yeah. So
I
British
tell
India
people
Company.
that I'm busy, and they still phone me.
There was that with regards to India, there was a slow infiltration and corruption process, but eventually the British actually did take more of a direct control after the Sepoy revolt of, what was it? It was like the 1857 or something like that.
Yeah, that was the Indian mutiny, where they
Yeah, it was
they
57.
abolished. Yeah. They abolished they abolished the East Indian Company and just took direct control.
Yeah. But yeah, notoriously the Sepoys, the Indian soldiers working for the British, they were really angry that the British used, I believe it was like some sort of cow hide in in the construction of their bullet casings or something like that. And it's sacrilege to, I guess, consume cow, and they had to bite into these cartridges to actually open them up. So the fact that their mouths touched these cow parts made them realize how, or it kind of red pilled them on how degenerate these eternal Anglos are. So they launched their own sort of proto-nationalist attempt to flip, or to get at least a little bit of autonomy back from the British. But after the British fully took over, you saw a lot more, I guess, investment into the empire rather than this unprofitable ass company. And then you really saw the construction of railroads and bridges and infrastructure, which I guess, I mean, we can have a conversation about, I guess, the pros and cons of building railroads and infrastructure, but there's also there's also the occasional famine caused by, I guess, British regulations on what portion of fields had to contain commercial crops.
Yes. Yeah. I'm actually very, very familiar with the 1943 Bengal famine. I will be making a very in-depth video on that at one point, because it's something that you constantly hear left-wingers complain about on the internet, left-wingers and Indian nationalists, claiming that it was like some sort of genocide against the Indians, which is ridiculous. And there's a lot of really dishonest academic literature on it, and there's some also honest academic literature on it. But I mean, I'm not saying that there weren't problems with famines in India at other points, but just the 1943 famine in particular, there's some very dishonest historiography about. But
what exactly did happen? Because all I hear from, I guess, leftists is that Churchill demanded more and more commercially grown foodstuffs to be shipped over to the British, so that Britain proper did not suffer from a famine during World War II. That's sort of the common history I hear.
Yeah, that's not like really accurate. It's really complicated. I mean, as you can imagine, during World War II, food supplies were really stretched to the brim. And in particular, the Burma had just fallen to the Japanese. Had just fallen to the Japanese, and Burma was the largest rice exporter in the world. So that was a large that was a large loss. But basically, the entire sort of popular left-wing narrative on the Bengal famine is based on a study from an economist called, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but Amartya Sen. And in the study, he claims, by looking at quote unquote official harvest data of rice, because that was where people got the vast majority of their calories in Bengal and India in general from, was rice. He claimed, from looking at quote unquote official harvest data, that there was more rice produced in 1943 in Bengal than there was in 1942.
And we've got the Blue Baron here. How's it going, Baron?
Doing well, thanks. Sorry I couldn't be on earlier. Like I said, Monday's a very busy day for me, so
no, it's all good, man. We're just talking about the Indian famine of, was it 43?
Yeah, 1943.
Yeah. Yeah, so the academic literature by, what was it, like Marsha Singh?
Amartya Sen. He's an economist. And yes, he did a study which he said was quote unquote on, and the specific term he used is very important because it's completely wrong. But he referred to it as official harvest data. And this is basically what every single historian that pushes this narrative cites, is his quote unquote official harvest data that he studied. But according to this quote unquote official harvest data in 1943, there was more rice produced than in 1942 in Bengal. Therefore, it's impossible for the famine to have been a result of a lack of rice, because there was more rice there than the previous year, and there was no famine the previous year. There's many issues with that. There's many issues with the narrative. And just so we're clear, for anyone listening, this isn't some sort of like weird internet right-wing historiography. Everything I'm debating from the dissident view is something that many professional academic historians have gone over. So this isn't like some weird like InfoWars thing.
I mean, but the more InfoWars view I've observed was from this book that I read from Chaos of Empire, which made the strong economic argument that, I guess, the British economic top-down transition from, I guess, subsistence farming and into commercial farming really screwed over the Indians and made these central Indian provinces, which were already susceptible to, I guess, to famine and to drought season, famine, even more susceptible than they already were. I don't know how true that was, but I guess these revisionists have a particular political interest in smearing the empire in whatever way they can.
Yeah. So the 1943 famine in particular, because I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Indian famines in general. The only famine that I know very in depth is the 1943 one. But like I said, it's all based on this quote unquote official harvest data. And there's multiple problems with this narrative, but this is the most concise one. The issue is there's no such thing as official harvest data from 1943 Bengal. That does not exist. Now he didn't make this up. He is talking about an actual official data set, but what Amartya Sen was talking about, and what he presented to the world as official harvest data, was official harvest forecasts. Now, that might not sound like a massive difference unless you really know what that means. But what these forecasts were people that were employed by the state to just go around to rice farms and just jot down some numbers and say, this is how much rice is growing. Now, for one, this was completely unscientific, the way these studies were done. So just the way this information was gathered makes it virtually useless. But even more importantly, we know there was an outbreak of a rice disease that year. And we know that when this forecast, not harvest data, when this forecast was done, that it would have been virtually impossible for anyone to have spotted this disease. And we know that a lot of the crops were destroyed by this disease, but we don't really have any idea how much, if it was like 10%, if it was 40%. But we know that this data is completely worthless because these people that went around and took these unscientific estimates of crop fields would have had absolutely no way of knowing how much of it was infected, because it was not possible to spot it unless you were someone specifically trained in spotting this disease, and these people were not. So the data is completely useless. It does not show at all what the guy claims it shows. And I've read multiple books on this subject, books published in the past couple of years, and these issues with Amartya Sen's research has been out there for decades. And the books I've read in the past couple of years, most professional academic historians just completely ignore all the problems. They just cite him. They say Amartya Sen's a genius. He knows what's going on, and they completely ignore the massive problems with it. They don't even try to address them.
I mean, I remember Academic Agent discussed how it was absolutely wrong that this one Indian economist, Marxist economist, said that the UK owed India $1 billion, or was it $1 billion or $1 trillion, something absurd.
I think it was
$1 trillion for the economic damage that did to India, and my famine and my economic instability. But I don't. It's absolutely absurd and has a lot to do with this post-colonialist nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Blue Baron, glad to have you on. Would you like to we have a lot of compliments in the chat, complimenting your monocle, your flags, but they're kind of disappointed that you don't have your top hat on.
Yes. I was actually expecting someone to mention that. No, see, Monday I usually clean the house and everything, and sometimes those duties spill over. I didn't really have time to change or anything. I just sort of threw on what I put on after the shower, and then that was about it.
No, it's all good, man. We're just glad to see you here. Yeah. And any do you want to make any points about how the British didn't do nothing wrong in with regards to India, or have any sort
of course, what people need to understand is there are two, well, it's not half and half, but there are two camps, first of all. And well, I suppose technically there's three, but the majority of people fall into one of two camps. These two camps are everything about colonialism is bad, and it seems like a lot of people today fall into that camp. And then there's the other camp that says, or at least that tries to say, everything about it was good. Now, either way, it's an oversimplification, of course. There are some negative effects to colonialism, to imperialism in general, just as there are negative effects to everything in general. But the fact of the matter is that there, in general, and this is a generalization because when you look at the British Empire as a whole, you're covering a whole lot of territory. But in general, and actually that's just to speak of the British Empire, but in general, there were far more benefits than there were drawbacks. Far more good came out of it than bad, I would say. And this is, first of all, and this is an example that will really surprise a lot of leftists today. Slavery was actually abolished in the British Empire 3 decades before it was abolished in the American Republic. And they did so without the need of any violent or bloody conflict to make it happen. There was, let's see, I forget what it was called exactly, but in the early 1830s, there was a proclamation made throughout the British Empire, so throughout all realms where the crown held sway, to abolish slavery. So at that time, that would have included Britain, of course, as well as the Caribbean colonies, Canada, South Africa, and a few other isolated places. But
I mean, people really look over the role that the UK played in eliminating the transatlantic slave trade and Zanzibar's slave trade. In the book, what was it called? In the book King Leopold's Ghost, it goes over the British Congo rather than a British colonies, but or the Belgian Congo rather than the British colonies. But the one of the justifications Leopold used for, I guess, making the Belgian Congo into his private serfdom was eliminating the Zanzibarian slave trade, which was still going on even into the 1880s and 1890s. So I mean that there's some good to that. That sort of colonialism. I mean, mountains of chopped off hands is one thing, but ending slavery is another. I mean,
yeah, I mean, I can't remember if I said this earlier during the stream or if I said this, or if I said this just before we were talking. But I mean, personally, I don't really find much of a need to moralize about historical events. I find this stuff interesting because I think it's interesting, and if there's certain narratives that I think we can get from it, I think that's interesting too. But like, I'm not like personally that interested. I'm interested in pushing back against what I think are false left-wing narratives, but I'm not. I don't think it's even really that relevant of a question. Like, was the Victorian empire good or bad? Like, I don't know. It's in the past. It's done. It's something that happened. I don't like fake left-wing narratives on it, but I don't feel any particular need to point out just how amazing it was either.
I mean, sorry about that. Like I said, busy day on Monday. A lot of things to do.
It's all good.
Help with the family.
But I guess one of the Thomas Carlyle arguments in favor of, I guess, sort of a top-down colonialization effort is you have these. I mean, in King Leopold's Ghost, the author cites cannibalism, telling foreigners to fuck off. These incredibly barbaric, primitive tribes that I guess were just dwelling by themselves on their own, bringing them into, I guess, a more civilized nation state is it's almost a humanitarian good. And you can make the evangelical missionary argument that bringing Christianity brings more souls into the fold of the more. I mean, Christianity as a whole is something of a good, rather than like animism and of course like widow burning in India, which I mean,
yeah, just unfortunate that it was Protestants that got most of them in Africa, but whatever.
Yeah, it did not help that of the colonialist powers, well, let's see, well, Britain and France had the two biggest empires, of course, but as far as I know, now I don't know whether most of Britain's missionaries came from the Church of England, but I don't think it was particularly helpful that each empire sort of brought a different denomination of Christianity. It seemed it would muddy the waters quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, in South Sudan, even today, you have a really weird, I guess, mixture of kind of Protestantism with animism and Ooga Booga chanting around tribal spirits.
Well, a lot of people don't know, but voodoo is actually came to be. It's actually a fairly recent invention. It came to be as sort of a mixture of African spiritualism and elements of Christianity. So it's one of the drawbacks, and even today in Africa, there are churches being created just from people sending out Bibles there. And I mean, bless them, they think they're doing a good thing, really. And there is a lot of good, but the Bible is a very good book, but in the end, it's a book and it needs someone to authoritatively interpret it. And when you look at some of the practices of different churches in Africa, there's, for example, something called liturgical vomiting. And that name alone should
trigger gag reflex.
There are certainly some.
I mean, there's certain benefits to eliminating cannibalism, ooga booga vomiting, widow burning, and African slavery. I mean, those are kind of undeniable goods. But
definitely.
I mean,
even just to someone who's secular, I mean, most of them would say that that's a good. At least I hope they would.
But cultural imperialism, though. What if I want to burn my wives?
That's the thing.
Yeah. Well,
though oddly enough, I've known people who've mentioned the issue of the thing about Great Britain abolishing slavery throughout the empire. I've known people who've mentioned that to Americans, and they've gotten them to sort of grudgingly accept that America actually would have been in a better situation if they hadn't rebelled, because and this is the ironic thing, the American Republic claims credit for ending slavery, but had America not rebelled in well, it wasn't America at that point, but the 13 colonies, had they not rebelled, had they remained the 13 colonies in union with the British Crown within the British Empire, then slavery would have been abolished in British North America at the same time as it was in the rest of the empire in, I believe it was 1833, but don't quote me on that. I know it was in the early 1830s. So if that had happened, then it could have been done 3 decades earlier and without any violence either. So I know people who have mentioned that and got Americans to sort of grudgingly admit that that it actually would have been a better situation if they hadn't rebelled.
I mean, how long was slavery legal in Jamaica? I'd be curious to know.
Well, it would have been abolished around that same period.
I mean,
after the abolishment, a lot of the like sugar plantations and stuff were moved to the colonies in East Asia, like places like Fiji, and they used indentured servitude and that type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough, I guess.
I mean, to be fair, most people cannot distinguish between indentured servitude and slavery. And in fact, when a lot of people, if they just hear the word servant, they immediately think slavery. But I mean, someone who has maids, that's technically servants. A maid or a butler is technically a servant, and that's really more in line with what indentured servitude is. Certainly more so than slavery.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be a massive expert on indentured servitude in Fiji, other than just the basics of
No, I know.
of like tea trade and stuff. That I know like some stuff about sugar. But the whole point of indentured servitude is that it was generally a fixed contract, and you'd get your freedom at the end of the contract. But like I said, I'm not going to pretend to know how long those contracts tended to be in Fiji. I think in the Americas they were generally like 7 to 10 years. That could be wrong.
I mean, but the point kind of still remains. What do you do with, I guess, an agriculturally based colony that no longer has a slave workforce when you've been using slaves for over a century? You can either, I mean, it's what Thomas Carlyle talked about in his rather spicier essay that I don't believe I can repeat on YouTube. Where what do you have? What do you do when you have an entire population sitting around eating pumpkins and not working? You kind of need something like a small bureaucracy or small group of economic elites to create work for the underlings. And I guess that's what one argument for economic colonialism is: turn these cannibals living a subsistence life into productive members of society. I mean, I guess that's less trad than I guess guys on Settler Lament and my side would like to say, but Ooga Booga substance like living off the land is not necessarily the way the way we'd like to see, I guess, society progress.
True.
I mean, so you end up with after economic colonialism with railroads in India and massive bridges being constructed and commercial products being made, and I cited earlier the factories in Calcutta and in Bengal, but I'd say we're all off a little bit better with these products than without them. So long as you know where your products are coming from, and they're not necessarily deterritorialized, as Deleuze and Guattari would say. But that's beyond that's I guess beyond the point.
Yes, one could argue the costs and benefits of contributing to the modern commercialization of everything, but that's an entirely different discussion. Today's consumerist culture.
Yeah, it's probably not a good thing. Just overconsumption and reducing everything to either consuming Netflix and McDonald's and then producing at whatever pencil pushing job you're at. But at the same time, going full Anne Prim Kaczynski, I don't think many people will actually want to go for that route. And I mean, I'm sure just many people in the developing world would like to progress above subsistence living. And I guess one of the crimes of colonialism is forcing more tribal hinterlands to integrate. I mean, we could talk about something like some of the more profitable African British protectorates that balanced progress and respecting tribal lands in the form of trusts. But I don't know. Do we want to go over some of the British protectorates, like now that we've kind of covered India? Or
we could. Let's see. My knowledge of the British protectorates is mainly limited to I believe Burundi, and that's about it. I more often studied the direct colonies, and I mind you, I have my knowledge of history has a more broader take in general, as opposed to specific details in particular places. But I have been reading up and working on that, so maybe we can fill each other in.
Like Settler's Lament is rather well read on the Southern Rhodesia question.
Yes, you did mention that earlier.
And we could kind of talk about, I guess, post-colonialism and what happens when you have a protectorate system that is actually kind of efficient and healthy and profitable for the native population, and when that all of a sudden goes away after World War II.
Mhm.
Like, but do we want to start off with, I guess, South Africa and Rhodesia, or?
Yeah, I can
Oh,
go
all
over
right.
some of the basics on that. I am somewhat familiar with South Africa too, but that I don't know. I don't think I don't think we have time to really go over both. And I'm more familiar with Rhodesia. But yeah, so just to give like a really brief overview of the history of that area, which is of course today now called Zimbabwe, for those of you who are unfamiliar. It was founded in 1892, when Cecil Rhodes hired a pioneer column to march north into north of South Africa, and set up, and they ended up setting up a colony there. Lots of stuff happened with the natives that led to that happening, but ultimately they had diamonds and other resources there. Um, and the colony was established under the British South Africa Company. And then in 1922, they transitioned from company rule to responsible government, where they had a vote among not they. It was never outside of South Africa. The sort of colonial privileges were very rarely explicitly based on race, though they were more or less implicitly based on that. But it was usually based on like wealth and education and that type of stuff.
Like, if I remember correctly, it was originally racially based, but then it was transitioned to property based. And since all of the landowners were white, with a couple non-white owners, it was rather unequal. And
Yeah.
I don't know, if you're in an economically depressed tribal hinterland and you kind of want a little piece of the commercial pie, a vote might actually sound kind of appealing. That's just one of the problems of, I guess, democracy and letting the poor's vote. But that's beside the point.
Yeah. But yeah. So in 1922 there was a vote. And for most of this period, from 1922 till 1980, which was the end of Rhodesia, the white population was between 3 and 5% of Rhodesia. The rest being non-white, mostly native. Though there always certainly were some non-white people who were immigrants from other parts of Africa or other parts of the world. I know in South Africa that was incredibly common. There were lots of African immigrants to South Africa, and there still are to this day, that were recent immigrants from other parts of the continent. Of course, like the Bantu aren't indigenous to South Africa; they're farther north. But I don't just mean like immigrant. I don't just mean people that have moved there over the past couple centuries. I mean, like in the past century, there's been many Black immigrants to South Africa. But because they've been relatively wealthy for a long time. But no. So in Rhodesia's case, in 1922, they had a referendum on responsible government. The three options was to continue company rule, become integrated into South Africa, or become their or have their own responsible government, and they chose the third. So that happened, and then from 1922 until 1950 something, I can't remember the exact day, or the exact year. But from 1922 until 1953, I have it right here. Or I think, I don't know, the exact year doesn't matter. But from 1922, for a while, it became the colony of Southern Rhodesia, and then there was another place called Northern Rhodesia. Though that when people refer to Rhodesia, they're not referring to Northern Rhodesia; they're referring to Southern Rhodesia. But then in the 1950s, the British tried to combine. They did this in several places in Africa, but they were trying to combine multiple colonies together to try and create sort of self-sustaining dominions, similar to what existed in Canada or New Zealand or Australia, or South Africa for that matter, where they just wanted to kind of create economically coherent countries and try and just jam a bunch of places together. So they tried doing that with Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and there was a third colony too, but I can't remember what it was. Where they just kind of jammed them all together and tried to see if it would work out. But there are obviously many problems with this. These were very diverse populations.
I think it was Malawi, by the way.
Yeah, that sounds right. So these were very different populations, very diverse, in like the real meaning of that word, not the progressive redefinition. So it didn't really work out very well. And this project was suspended in 1963, I think. And then in 1965 was what was called November 11th was what was called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, which was when Ian Smith, the leader of the Rhodesian Front, the government in Rhodesia, unilaterally declared independence. The date was specifically chosen because that was after they had sold. That's after like harvest for that year, and they had sold a lot of their crops. So because they knew that they were going to get embargoed after declaring independence, so they wanted to make the money for the year before that happened. So that happened, and then that kicked off that basically kicked off international the international community condemning Rhodesia, and both the Soviets and the British and the Americans trying to undermine it and trying to force them to surrender to the international community. And that was a 15-year-long conflict called the Rhodesian Bush War, where there were communist insurgents throughout the country that were fighting a war against the Rhodesian government, which ultimately led to the destruction of the Rhodesian state. And then there was a small transition state called Zimbabwe Rhodesia, and then there was Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe afterwards, which Robert Mugabe was one of the leaders of one of the two communist revolutionary factions. And yeah, so that's the basic history.
Yeah, I mean, there was, of course, there was the oil embargo in which the British refused to supply Southern Rhodesia with oil necessary to upkeep any of its infrastructure. But at the time, Portugal, which also had its own anti-colonialist elements, opened up its ports to oil being transported into Southern Rhodesia. There's also the Marxists who came in from Cuba and the USSR and Mao's China, which tried to subvert the Rhodesians.
Also
something about desegregation and universal suffrage is very, very ominous when it's being almost always supported by communists.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Also, there are our friends from Israel. They sold Rhodesia lots of weapons during this period.
Oh, that's actually kind of interesting.
Yeah, Rhodesia, Portugal, and South Africa were basically, Portugal, South Africa, and Israel were basically Rhodesia's three allies. Though no country was willing to publicly recognize them as a legitimate state, not even those three countries.
You're gonna say something, Baron?
Yeah, just what you said about how it looks bad when communists are always the ones supporting these things. That's a lesson that people would do well to learn. It's a lesson that sadly Haile Selassie of Ethiopia learned too late.
I mean, you want to talk about? I mean, we could go over, I guess, the Derg and how that completely ruined Ethiopia. I mean, I know most of what I know about what happened to Ethiopia. It's not British Empire, part of the British Empire, but
No,
um,
no. I mean, I wasn't saying we should get into all of that. Just uh, that just using that really as a historical example of how people should sort of better recognize the evil of communism, really, because really I can't think of it as anything other than an evil.
I mean, what you had in southern in good old Rhodesia was a stable hierarchy of responsible land concentrated landowners who had a vested interest in seeing that their nation survive and thrive. What you had when you have what resulted from universal suffrage was the commons being robbed by Mugabe and his ilk, who, I mean, seizing the means of production is seizing the means of production is always a great way of ruining your country, and seizing land from responsible hierarchical landowners it's a quick way to end up in a famine. As
Yeah, it is important to note, though, in Zimbabwe, for the next 20 years after the end of the Bush War, things did stay relatively the same for a while. It wasn't until the early 2000s when the land reform that's so famous happened and that the whole country was destroyed. There was certainly a decline after the Bush War, but for a while, Mugabe was willing to allow the white farmers to continue to own their land and things to operate relatively similar to how it did before. It wasn't really that Marxist resentment didn't really build up until the early 2000s, which is when they started stripping people of their land. Then the country was completely destroyed. So I mean, I'm not saying that things were perfect for that 20-year period, but it wasn't. But the country wasn't really destroyed until the 2000s.
I mean, is part of that just inheriting a very functional, profitable breadbasket?
Yeah,
then,
I mean, they allowed much of the civil service and much of the the landowners and stuff to just continue to operate as it did. So yeah, things just continue to operate in similar ways as it used to.
Yeah. I mean, something similar is happening in I guess South Africa, where you have your Mugabes starting to creep into the picture, and although the status quo looks somewhat okay and stable, as soon as I guess
Not really. It's they have like some of the highest unemployment rates in the world. I think I've heard it like as high as 40%. I could be wrong. I mean, and that was before this whole most recent crisis, which I'm sure has risen it dramatically.
By stable, I mean inheriting the apartheid hierarchy, and then Mandela kind of just letting it run while instituting his corrupt reforms and his what was it called, and his
Black economic empowerment,
like, yeah,
because that wasn't under him. That was 2004, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah,
but
this I am less familiar with South Africa, but when Mandela was in power, I don't think much of the economics of the country changed that much.
No, not that much. But now, I mean, now you're really starting to see the results of democratic reforms with seizing land and seizing land without paying for it and redistributing land to people who don't know how to farm. I mean, there's the good old meme of academic agent saying that he could learn to farm by just Googling it, but that's beyond the point. I mean, there were a couple other examples of countries going the way of Rhodesia. Like Mozambique notoriously went the way of Rhodesia. liquidating all of the productive commercial farmland. I mean, are you guys at all familiar with Gandhi's economic policies? But it's absolutely startling when you look up how much GDP declined after Gandhi took over. But I don't know if I'd just be talking to myself, but
Wasn't all that like I'm not all that familiar with his economic policies. With regards to economics, I knew he was closer to socialism than anything else, but I mean, maybe not completely, but I knew that it wasn't like that. That's basically the extent of my knowledge of his economic policies.
I mean, his general breadbasket of policies was he wanted to get back to communal, kind of quasi-communitarian, socialistic subsistence farming based around indigenous populations. But in order to fuel that fire, he kind of liquidated a lot of the good old factories that the British had brought, and it's essentially pulling what. Wait, who was in Venezuela before Maduro? What was his name? Fidel? No, it's not. Who was the? He pulled a Cesar Chavez and used the productive elements of the economy to fuel his little communes, which I don't know. That's never a good way to go. I don't know. Do you guys want to talk about, I guess, the protectorates of the Middle East? I mean, that's a rather spicy Sykes-Picot sort of discussion.
We could. How do you feel about that, Settler?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar on Middle Eastern history.
Yeah.
I mean, during the just to give like a kind of general overview, during the late 1800s, you had the British establishing these refueling stations throughout the Indian Ocean, but and that's where Yemen and Oman and a lot of the UAE, Qatars, and Kuwaits were that's what they were used for, as refueling stations in the middle of the desert, where these steamships would pick up coal and then just keep going, but I guess in order to protect India, the British had a vested interest in protecting Afghanistan and the Middle East as a whole, to prevent, I guess, Russian encroachment into India. And then you had the rise of oil and oil extraction. So you had all those plentiful fields of these plentiful oil fields in Iraq and all of this Kurdish territory. Then you had like Sykes-Picot right after World War One. The Ottomans were broken up, and the what was the Saud family? Each of the inheritance of the Saud family were given their own little petty kingdoms. Like Jordan was just a couple towns in the middle of the desert with a bunch of janky shapes drawn around it. Then you had Iraq, which is just another janky state ruled by a tin pot king.
So it was certainly better as a kingdom than it became as a republic.
Well, I mean, a lot of the sort of patterns I've noticed with post-colonialist nation states is that, or just states, is that you either have a secular military tin pot dictator, or you have these religious fanatic nut jobs. So you either had, I guess, in Egypt, the military dictator, or you had the religious fanatics. You either had, no, I'm starting to blank. You either had, who's the dictator that was, or the military president who was overthrown? No.
The guy that's overthrown.
Recently.
Mubarak?
Yeah, Mubarak. He was overthrown by the Brotherhood and the Islamic Brotherhood, and then the Brotherhood tried to mess with the Constitution. And then you had the military dictatorship. So you had that really weird dialectic. And I don't know, without a stable British bureaucracy controlling everything, these petty dictators and fanatics will just swing one way or the other.
Mhm.
And that's a situation no one really wants to live under. I mean,
Though it's not just a matter of having a British bureaucracy. When you see, like, when the Ottoman Empire broke up, of course, that's where states like Syria, Iraq, that all came from that, because that was all Ottoman territory at the time. But as you know, Syria and Lebanon, when it became French mandates, and Iraq, Jordan, and Kuwait became British mandates, along with Palestine. The British set up Arab kingdoms helped set up Arab kingdoms in Jordan, Iraq, and Kuwait, whereas the French didn't really do much with Syria and Lebanon. I think there was a failed attempt to establish a kingdom in Syria, but nothing much came of it.
Yeah, there was sort of a petty kingdom, but Lebanon's actually a really interesting case study because it was notoriously the Paris of the Middle East. You had these like the French had held claims in Lebanon even as the Ottoman Empire was in existence, because it was land that was taken during the French land taken during the Crusades, and they still pressed those claims even into the early 1900s. And
that is actually hilarious to me as a monarchist, because the idea of the French Republic having any legitimacy to those claims, it reminds me of the situation with China today, where China
citing its influence in the South China Sea,
Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, all those as its territory, despite none of that actually being part of China proper, but being part of the Great Qing Empire, which wasn't China itself. It's like they only have a claim to it if they're a monarchy. It's just it's kind of amusing. It's also kind of saddening, but people understand the situation.
What the French did in Lebanon was something like they did a strategy of divide and conquer, where they'd use these sort of very well educated minorities called the Druze and the Maronites. The Druze are like my one of my history professors referred to the Druze as the Islamic Mormons. Like they have these like really weird esoteric practices and sort of esoteric tribal elders who spoke in quiet, walled off rooms, and then you had the Shiites and Sunnis kind of in the hinterlands. But then after the French left, it descended into chaos, where the hinterlands kind of overtook the Druze and Maronites in this horrific civil war, where the Jews and Christians were notoriously yeeted from the country, and it kind of went to shit in this, like, I think it was like a 5-way civil war. It was absolutely insane, and I think like 200 or so American Marines were blown up under Reagan during the Civil War. But
and that's kind of a situation where it's different with the Arab kingdoms that were set up. I mean, you look at Jordan today and Kuwait today, and they're both stable, prosperous countries. Whereas you look at Iraq, and as soon as the monarchy that had been set up was overthrown, everything, well, it's never been really a stable country since. It's just been one war after another, one conflict after another, one tin pot, either a tin pot dictator or a religious extremist like Saddam Hussein. It's just, it's funny. You look at it, the British leaving, And you see where they set up an actual monarchy, it did well when it remained a monarchy for the most part.
Well, Jordan is an interesting example because it's ethnically homogenous, A, and B, the monarch has a very good claim on the land, and there's nothing there. It can only go kind of upwards, while I guess Iraq and Syria have oil fields to fight over and resources. So there's, I mean, it's called the resource trap for a reason, where you have all of this conflict in Uganda or in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because it has all of these natural resources that exacerbate ethnic tensions, because who is going to own these resources and how are the profits going to be distributed. And I mean, you see, I guess, fuel to the fire, like ethnic tensions are sort of a fuel to the fire, and India and its breakup is a perfect example of this. I mean, if you want, like, we could talk about, I guess, the breakup of India, because getting back to, yes, direct British colonies, or like, do either of you guys want to go over the want to specify what happened with the breakup of India, or like a settler?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like massively familiar with the partition, to be honest. My knowledge of Indian history mostly ends with World War II, honestly.
Well,
I mean, I know the basics, but
just
yeah.
Yeah, just the basics are decent.
Yeah. So, are you going to say, or do you want
well,
me to?
I can just go over it.
Okay.
But this massive colony of or this massive territory of India, it contained both it contained Pakistan, modern day India, Ceylon, Bangladesh, and Burma. And when it gained its independence, it the British tried to avoid the problems that it fell into with a lot of these other post-colonial countries by divvying up the ethnic populations. So you had Pakistan, which was a Muslim, the Muslim majority nations, which was just West Pakistan, which is just modern Pakistan, and Eastern Pakistan, which was Bangladesh. I mean, there was, of course, the Pakistani civil war, where where Bangladesh split off from Pakistan proper, but that's a total different thing. I don't know. It's either you have some sort of ruling ironclad minority in power, or you have some sort of ethnic tyranny or ethnic violence. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of funny, the left-wing narratives that you hear on some of these topics, because, like, with the Middle East, with the Sex-Pico agreement, I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right. That type of stuff, you constantly have left-wingers complaining that, oh, like, it's the empire's fault that there's constant conflict here because you just drew random borders on the map. But then when you get stuff like the partition of India, which was specifically done to give people ethnic homelands and to split things up on ethnic lines, then it's like, oh my god, this is your fault that everything bad is happening, that these places are having conflict. You polarize them between ethnicities and religions and stuff. It's just you obviously can't win with these people. But yeah, and I'm none of that to say that either of those things were done ideally. It's just when you're debating left-wingers on this, it's obvious that they're not actually interested in the positives and negatives of these specific historical events. They're just interested on trying to insinuate that that these places were evil and that everything they did was evil.
I think one of the problems with with the ethnic versus rainbow coalition sort of approach is that in India there were these specific communities that were incredibly conscious of a greater whole, but in Africa you had small ethnic groups and small tribes that didn't have a national identity in the modern sense. And I keep on repeating this, but before the before the French Revolution, people in France ethnically identified with their little locality, the equivalent of like a county or something like that. The only people who were considered ethnically French were people immediately around the area of Paris, and everybody kind of identified with their city and their specific province. But after the French Revolution, you had the national identity, and I guess these African nations and these post-colonial nations they didn't have their French Revolution. They didn't have the, I guess, cultural the vernacular to identify with the nation state, and they're still in the process of tribes and very localized communities.
Well, I mean, there's a certain truth to that, but on the other hand, the concept of the nation state didn't begin with the French Revolution. While it's true that people in France identified more with their specific region than with France itself before that, there was a general idea, there was a concept of France. It's just, well, first of all, religion was more important than ethnicity for most of European history. Not that ethnicity wasn't important, but religion was more important. But there was always an underlying concept of what French was. That's, for example, a good example of this is the 100 Years' War, where France and England had been fighting for a while. England had ended up ruling a large portion of what is now France and what was French at the time, really. But the issue is that that people, well, sorry, I'm
it's all good, man. I mean, I guess what? So 100 Years War and the birth of the modern nation state. I mean, we could talk about, I guess,
train of thought for a moment there. What I was going to say was that.
Do you want to talk about like Westphalia and the impact of that?
I was just bringing this up as an example to say that the concept of a nation state existed before then, and the main thing about it is that the French were still fighting to be free from English rule because they still knew that a Frenchman was not the same as an Englishman. One also has to look at the historical context of the time. At that time, England had the same religion as France, and even had kings who spoke more French than English. But the French people still knew that a Frenchman was not the same as an Englishman, and they had their own identity.
I I guess you could say, yeah, in these post-colonialist struggles, these diverse tribes of Africa, they might not have had, I guess, a unifying identity, but they knew who the Anglos were, just the same way the French knew that the English are the foreign tyrants coming over to rule them. But in terms of who rules who, I don't know. There's it's weird. It's weird. I'm not sure how to actually process or how to process the concept of identity over time with these anachronistic like modern concepts. Like obviously the idea of like French was separate from the idea of say Italian at the time, just on pure language alone.
Mhm.
The same way, I guess. Like, so let's use like Sudan as a good example. It's religiously and ethnically divided, with a Muslim north and a Christian south, a more Middle Eastern Semitic people in the north, a very, very black population in the south, right? So you have multiple lines of division. The Sudanese Civil War happened multiple there are various iterations of the Sudanese Civil War. It broke up. They have their own nation states. And now, I guess the more unified north is at least somewhat stable. Meanwhile, the south is in almost constant schizophrenia and civil war, because these Southern Africans, they have their own like little ethnic issues to deal with. I forget what the tribes are that are fighting in the civil war right now, but I don't know. There's no conception of identity of higher identity within the South Sudanese nation state. Like the South Sudanese can identify who the Sudanese occupiers are, but they can't identify with a higher South Sudanese identity. I don't know, something like that.
And that's part of the reason, I think, why the only time many of these nations had sort of stability was in the British Empire, because there was sort of a higher identity. And not to say that most people thought of themselves as British even in these areas, but take India, for example. If you look at India today, a lot of people don't know this, but the culture is actually quite British. They often they speak English for most of the time, for one thing, a lot more than most of the rest of the world. They'll often switch to Hindi mid-speaking, but I'd say at least 75%, well, the vast majority of them do speak English. The cricket also is extremely popular there. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, comes from being British for so long. And there's also the pronunciation, the Indian accent really took some pronunciations from the received pronunciation. Certainly not as much as South Africa or Australia, but it certainly was influenced by it. There's throughout the British Empire, there's a higher identity, not in the sense that everyone fully identifies with it, but there is something higher that one can look to as something, being part of something bigger than oneself.
I mean, I guess we could talk about how I guess the Africans brought in from Algeria, or the natives brought in from Algeria into the French army during World War One. These French people, these Algerians, identified with their French overlords in a very, very intimate kind of way. Like I remember, I forget what live stream I was listening to, but some guy said his like Kenyan friend was incredibly proud to have been like under like such benevolent British rule. I mean, the British brought civilization to this incredibly primitive, disorganized, subsistence level continent. I guess when you remove such a massive structure, like what do you have other than disunified schizophrenia, Chinese coming in to pick up the infrastructural improvements and investments. I don't know.
And people identifying with it does even exist still to this day. And that's one example, what you mentioned. But also there's the fact that most of the, like before World War II, there weren't really that many minorities, as it were, in Europe, but most of the people that today we'd call minorities came from different parts of in Britain and France, came from different parts of their empire afterwards, usually shortly after the decolonialization process started.
Mhm.
So there was certainly a lot of them were identifying with them as French or as British, and even still today, you get a lot more immigrants to, like, for Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, you get a lot more immigrants there from former British colonies and Commonwealth realms than you do from say China or some other nation that didn't really have as much of a relationship with them.
Like I remember in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of immigration to Britain from Jamaica and the Caribbean and from India.
Yes.
I mean, that's where you got like chicken tikka masala. It was like from the OG Indians coming to the motherland. But I don't know. It's kind of interesting. Higher loyalties to the mother empire.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's
And a lot of people just assume that everyone in a colony thought of only themselves and never thought of a higher identity, a higher anything like that. But when you look at how much immigration has come to Britain and the Commonwealth from former colonies, and the same situation with France, and also with the Netherlands as well, they got a lot of immigration from their former colonies. What you see that there is a case of identifying, and it's like the British. That's why the British identity is something. It's partly ethnic, but it's also more of an ideal, really, and something that, like, a culture more than an ethnicity.
So you mean sort of like a spiritual hierarchy of elites where you have, I guess, these these imperialists of higher virtue come in and say, no, don't burn your widows, build roads, and don't just be a subsistence farmer, be a part of this much larger system alongside your compatriots.
I don't know, that sounds like some progressive BS. Return to tradition.
Um, what are you, Gandhi? It's like, come on.
I guess Gandhi was the original Nazbol traditionalist.
I mean, unironically, he kind of was.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, you could also argue that he was extremely progressive. I mean, because shortly, I don't remember if it was before or after he came officially to power, but I know shortly after India gained independence, all of its traditional monarchies were abolished. Every last one of its princely states and maharajas and all that,
Mhm.
all of them were abolished. And some of the families still have their wealth today, of course, but they had actual kingdoms back then. And
Mhm.
yeah, so one can make the argument that India was more traditionally Indian under the British because it remained an empire, which is what it had been every time it was united in history, like with the Mughal Empire and let's see if there was another one, I believe, but every time there was sort of a unified state in India, it was
about the Marathas.
with many princely states.
I mean, if I remember correctly, the last great Hindu nation was the Marathas Confederacy Like, I don't know if any of you guys have played Empire Total War, but
No,
I don't
no.
know. It's a pretty fun game to play. But I don't know, these higher loyalties or something. It's almost admirable. But then you have like the unironic Nazbols like Mugabe, like black ethno nationalist, but also a literal communist, sort of coming into being. I don't know, something like that. Post-colonialism is a mess, though.
Yes.
Like here's sort of a broader, a little bit of a better question. How should have the United Kingdom dealt with the breaking up of the empire after the Suez crisis? That's sort of an interesting question. Colonialism was going the way of the dog anyways. How should the UK have dealt with it better? There was the nation state model of breaking India up into its own little ethnic nation states, and then there's just leaving them to the dogs like Nigeria and Sudan. But I don't know. Is there any way that the UK could have dealt with it better?
Well, supposing that the end of colonialism was inevitable, and really, I'm of the opinion where nothing in history is really inevitable because, well, I mean, if you from a deterministic perspective, if free will exists, then nothing is inevitable. But that's more philosophical than we're really discussing right now, isn't it? But if we look at it right at the end, where supposing we have to decolonize, what do we do? Then it certainly would have made more sense to at least start with well, actually, you don't even need to just start with it. When you look at how many former colonies just became Commonwealth realms and stayed that way, by Commonwealth realm, I mean not just a member of the British Commonwealth. There are a lot of actual republics in the Commonwealth as well, but a Commonwealth realm where the Crown still holds power as head of state, but there is local self-governance. Each of them are sovereign nations in their own right, and that sort of thing was done very successfully in Canada, despite the fact that there were ethnic tensions. I mean, you look at, there's the British Canadians and the French Canadians, and that is always a thing, and that is still a thing today. But the British were very good at being able to settle those tensions and do it in a way where national self-governance could be done, and could be done peacefully, and while also remaining a part of the British Empire and then the British Commonwealth. Now, with India, of course, it would be a much more complicated situation. But I would think that if you start with a Commonwealth realm, and then you look at, like, the British only directly ruled, I think it was about a third of India, and the rest was done, like at first that was done through the British East India Company, I believe, and then later
indirectly through the Maharajas and whatever principalities existed.
Well, indirectly through the Maharajas, the princely states, and all that. So if you're going to transition to local self-governance, a good place to start would be, you've already got 2/3 of it having local self-governance with the Maharajas and princely states. So that's a very good starting point. And from there, you look at which parts are under more direct rule, and you look at it, it can introduce more autonomous forms of governance in there. And you can really, you could have sort of a confederation model, like this, I forget what the example is, but there's
like, I hope you're not insinuating like having a Yugoslavia kind of situation.
No. I'm thinking more along the lines of What's that
Well,
that country in Asia, the one that's a federal monarchy, where you have
Nepal?
no, not Nepal. You have several.
Bhutan, Brunei, Malaysia, or was it? It's not Malaysia. It's I don't know. One of those countries is a monarch. I mean, Bhutan is a monarchy. Brunei is a monarchy.
No, but you mean like a federal monarchy, where like the German Empire, where you have a sort of a national monarch and then several subnational monarchies, and it all works in tandem as a confederation of a nation, really. And I think something similar could have been done with India, given enough time. You already had 2/3 of it having local governance with the Maharajas and princely states. It wouldn't be that hard to have the remaining areas sort of transition into autonomous regions within a sort of confederation under the crown. And it certainly, I think that would have actually would have been able to soothe ethnic tensions a lot better, because when I look at the history of India, and I'm not an expert on it, of course, I'm more familiar with European history, but I do know that India was able to India was able to be sort of a united nation under several different empires, but they all had the main thing they had in common was that there was sort of a national level monarchy and many subnational monarchies within it. And
Gotcha.
and I think that honestly would have been the best option, because with something like the Mughal Empire or the Confederation you mentioned, or really even with the Empire of India at the start of it under the British, there was, because it was a more federated state, the tensions between the different ethnicities, or more specifically the different religions, Muslim and Hindu, weren't as pronounced, and they didn't affect things negatively as much.
Gotcha. How about you, Settlers Lament? Ways of breaking up the empire without letting it go to the dogs?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it certainly is always much more difficult to be constructive than to criticize things. I suppose, for one, the sort of like fire sale nature that it turned into, where they just wanted to get rid of everything relatively quickly, was seems to have been relatively clearly a mistake.
Yes.
But I mean, that's even one issue where I've even had progressives agree on that perhaps a slower transition period might have helped. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, a lot of it, the world does change, and change has to happen, and decolonization wasn't just a result of it was a result of a lot of things, but it wasn't just a result of Western powers losing the nerve to continue their empires. It was also a result of mass production of very easy to use firearms, but and other things too. But I don't know. I mean, if we're looking at, say, Rhodesia, for example, the Rhodesian government was able to persist for 15 years with the entire world trying to destroy it. So I would like to push back a little bit.
Better it could have lasted.
Yeah, if it was, if the West continued trying to maintain those sorts of governments. So yeah, I don't think it is nearly as inevitable as one might think. I'm not saying that certain aspects of it may have been inevitable, but the idea that Britain had to go from controlling a quarter of the world in 1922 to losing all of that in a couple decades. I don't think there was really anything that inevitable about that, especially once you get to the last few places that the British have lost, say Hong Kong, which clearly would have much preferred being a British colony than a Chinese colony.
Very much so. And the ironic thing about Hong Kong is Britain's agreement was made with the Great Qing Empire, which again, you get into what is China, what isn't, but they only really have a claim on it because the emperor held a claim. Like the agreement was with the Great Qing Empire that they would return it to them specifically after a certain period of time. But by the time that period of time went by, the Great Qing Empire no longer existed. So,
well, that actually is somewhat mistaken too, because the core of what we call Hong Kong actually was not purchased, because as you may or may not know, the Hong Kong was first taken by the British. It was a 99-year lease, which for one, the 99-year leases, that was generally understood to be when those treaties were signed, that was generally understood as permanent secession of the territory. 99 years was kind of a euphemism, but that's besides the point. The actual core of what we call Hong Kong was not leased. It was not leased for 99 years. The core of what we call Hong Kong was ceded permanently after the First Opium War. There were surrounding areas that were later leased for 99 years. But the core of what began as Hong Kong was permanently ceded to the British Empire. So yeah, it didn't really have anything to do with the lease coming due. It just, the British didn't care about trying to maintain their presence there, and the Chinese really wanted to take it over.
Though you can't deny that people were using the lease as an excuse.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, if France could hold on to the claim of having cultural links to Lebanon and having some sort of cultural right to the land, even into the 1800s, in spite of what happened in the 1300s, I don't see British giving up Hong Kong just for some legalistic reason as being quite up to snuff. I feel like Hong Kong is just about as British as you can get. You contrast that with America's relationship with Liberia, where it had quite a one-for-one, just about a one-for-one copy of the Constitution and governing polities as the ruling system, and yet it's just about as different to America as you can get. But Hong Kong has remained a very, very British. And what do you even think it is right now? Is it still kind of? I don't think it's right to call it a colony, but is it a commonwealth, or like what technically is it?
I mean, technically, of course, it's. I believe it's a. I forget the term used, but a special region of China. But I mean, realistically speaking, I think what it most effectively can be described as is a British Commonwealth, because the identity there, and that's one of the things, it's identity, and ethnicity isn't really as much part of it with something like Hong Kong as it would be with, say, Canada or Australia. But when you look at it, well, with the protests, I remember seeing a lot of people waving the Hong Kong blue ensign or the Union Jack, and saying that they want to be a crown colony again. So the identity, I would say, is that of at the very least a sort of British Commonwealth realm.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. So British Commonwealth, I think that has ended up being the most. Dominions and commonwealths seem to be the best, I guess, way of governing a proper British colony instead of just instead of protectorates.
And I mean, Commonwealth really and Dominion. The term Commonwealth realm really only came into existence later. Like, often they were termed collectively as the Dominions, but really officially, like for example, Canada was officially called the Dominion of Canada. Then you had Australia, which from its inception was called the Commonwealth of Australia, or then you had the Union of South Africa, and they all had this sort of separate title to them, but they were often referred to collectively as the Dominions because because they all shared that core sort of British identity to them.
There's this one like really weird pattern. I think someone mentioned in some other video that I don't know off the top of my head, but the British, whenever they colonize, and I mean colonize rather than set up a protectorate, whenever they colonize a country, they always seem to recreate the sort of apartheid model of separate. I mean, when British colonists show up, they create their own individual communities and don't assimilate to the natives the same way the, say, Spanish or Portuguese did in Latin America. Instead, they have their own, I guess, elitist, like pure white communities rather than integrate or have any sort of stratified hierarchy.
There is certainly a lot of truth to that, although one could say that that may actually be like a more, like a less elitist option. I mean, when you look at the Spanish, for example, there was certainly a racial hierarchy in place in the Americas. For example, I believe the only people who had been, you didn't just have to be ethnically Spanish, you had to be born in Spain to be a governor there. But because they, well, part of it is actually they brought no women with them, only priests, the original conquistadors. So they're naturally, they sort of started to amalgamate, and it created the distinct sort of, new ethnicity is a bit of a strong word, but sort of a combined ethnicity that exists in sort of Latin America, Spanish America today. And whereas in British North America, it was a different situation, because not only because they formed their own local communities, bringing women with them helped, of course, but also because the British North America was actually more sparsely populated by the American Indians. With the Spanish regions, you had places like the Incan Empire, the Aztec Empire, which were sort of actual real nation states almost, or pretty much. Whereas with higher up in British North America, or what became British North America, you had much smaller communities of American Indians and much more spread out, really more tribes than anything else, not really nations as we would recognize the term. And that's part of the reason why they didn't, or why they sort of faded out from relevance over time.
Like, I mean, where the British specifically landed colonists on, it's like Canada, the 13 colonies, Australia, New Zealand. These are relatively depopulated areas. And these are compared with, I guess, the African protectorates and India and Burma, which are very, very thoroughly populated with these massive indigenous populations. But I'm not exactly sure what I remember seeing these gigantic charts of ethnic hierarchies of Brazilian society, but you never see those types of things with the eternal Anglo colonies. I don't know. I don't know. You just had these I guess you had the landowners at the top, the middling bureaucrats, and then the rest of the indigenous population. I don't know. And
I mean, part of it was a lot of the indigenous population remained sort of in tribal communities, and in a tribal community, there's really not much place for them in an actual nation state. I mean, they don't really participate in the economy, as it were. So they're not really players on the scale of of what exactly goes on in the nation. It's like tribes in places like the Amazon today. They really have nothing to do with what's going on in the nation around them. So it's a more
it's like you don't really see many Spaniards going and finding an Amazonian waifu, as opposed to I guess I mean I remember seeing in this one sort of funny video of the history of the Roman Empire. I forget what it was called, but when this one Roman legion was going through, I guess, Jordan, or they found exactly one quote unquote civilized family in the entirety of the desert, and it was just a couple aristocrats held out in I think it was Tyre. It wasn't Tyre. Anyway, but when you're going out to colonize and you're looking to set up a family, I guess integrating with the natives isn't necessarily the best the best way of holding on to your British identity. And I guess that's. I mean, I did an extensive amount of research for the on the Quiet Revolution for my next video, and this reoccurring theme of the Quebecois trying to keep their populations stable and trying to retain the in-group and not be absorbed into Anglo-Canada is just this reoccurring theme. And what happened in the Quiet Revolution was in between 1960 and 1970, the average birth rate was like, it dropped from, I think it was like 3.8 to 1.9 children per woman, and that was the death knell of the Quebecois. They're just going to completely be erased. And I can see like some small community of bureaucrats in India or whatever colony it is. You have this like sliver of the homeland, and you don't necessarily want to forget where your people are from, and then and just, I guess, assimilate. But you compare that to, I guess, these haciendas and sort of quasi feudal communities of Latin America, where I guess, I don't know, you have 500 years of history, 400 years of history and integration. I don't know. It's a weird place to be.
Well, I mean, there was still sort of a Spanish identity in Latin America for most of its colonial history, but and honestly, when you look at the history of some of the different nations that came to be after independence, it happened during the Napoleonic Wars, of course, when Spain was ruled by, I believe it was Napoleon's brother, was it?
I think that's just about right.
Yes. Well, anyway, he was placing his relatives on thrones around Europe, but a lot of the colonies, I know one in particular, though I can't for the life of me remember the name, remained loyal to who they believed was the legitimate king of Spain, and instead of submitting to the French-backed government there, governed themselves and for the time during the Napoleonic Wars. Though oddly enough, this people that then they got a bit used to self-governance and revolutionary elephants. I'm sorry.
That sounds.
Revolutionary.
Are you trying to like recite the history of Brazil? Because I remember during the Napoleonic Wars, the Brazilian king or the Portuguese king liked Brazil more than his homeland, and
Yes,
kind of
that
just
was
wanted to set up his.
different. No, I'm talking about a Spanish colony, but that's actually a very interesting situation. Yes, but this Spanish colony sort of practiced self-governance during the Napoleonic Wars because they didn't recognize the French-backed government in Spain. But once the Napoleonic Wars were over, a lot of them had gotten used to self-governance and revolutionary elements, yes, within the society. Sort of took this as an opportunity to clamor for independence.
And that's kind of what the story of the Bolivarian revolutions were in Latin America, I guess. I think, yeah, Simon de Bolivar, his big push for Latin American independence could have only happened after 2 decades of Napoleon ruling Spain and imperial neglect. And that's also kind of what happened with the 13 colonies. I mean, Britain always kind of had a laissez-faire attitude to letting the colonies do whatever the hell they wanted so long as they traded with the motherland. But I guess, that kind of breeds a certain amount of independence. But I don't know. I think I don't know about Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but somehow those guys, somehow you guys seem to have a little bit more connection with the British than we did over time. I mean, you're still flying a British flag in your background.
Yes, I am. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are a number of factors for that, of course, but part of it is with Canada. The whole reason we exist as a distinct and ultimately sovereign nation is because rather than join with the American revolutionaries in rebelling against Great Britain, we chose to remain loyal to Britain and to the monarchy, and a large portion of the settlers of what became English Canada were actually loyalists fleeing the United States, or what became the United States after the American Revolution. So that's a lot of the reason why we remained that way, because such a core part of the foundations were laid specifically for the reason of remaining loyal to Britain and to monarchy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's I mean, I kind of I could understand that. I mean, having your entire identity being based around anti American independencism is kind of a good way of breeding loyalty. But I don't know.
Nowadays, there's this weird anti-American nationalism, which
nationalism.
We know what we're anti, but we don't know what we're pro. So, and that's what we've forgotten, the British identity. We've retained the part about not liking the American identity and not wanting any part of it. But because people have sort of more forgotten the British part of our identity, what you have is a nation that's sort of confused as to what exactly they are.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Moldbug talked about this a fair bit. What he described it as is that we're not anti-American anymore. We're ultra-American. We're upset. We're upset with the Americans for not being American enough. And it's like a spectrum that we went from anti-American to like neutral during World War II to ultra-American after World War II.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. So it's been about 2 hours, guys. I guess I'd like to collect some final thoughts before signing off. So British Empire, what do you think of it? Was it a good thing, a net positive for the world, or are
I'd say
there
on the
or,
whole, net positive, definitely. And again, part of that is loyalty does come into the picture, not just for me as a Canadian, but in general, since so many parts of the British Empire were actually, even direct colonies were often set up by diplomatic agreements with local rulers. I mean, as one has to say that international agreements have some validity. And if one says that, then one has to see legitimacy behind the empire. So I would say that overall a net positive and definitely a legitimate deal.
definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely say overall the empire is a net positive, but like I said, with history, I'm not incredibly interested with moralizing about the specifics. So I don't know. I think I think there's a lot that can be learned from history about narratives and about how things play out. It's all kind of water under the bridge about like the whether I don't think whether or not it even is a net positive, though I think it is even that important of a question.
No, well, fair enough. Well, I guess that's it. Remember to subscribe to the Blue Baron and Settlers Lament. I'm putting Blue Baron first because Settlers Lament has put subscribe to Settlers Lament. What is it, like 3 times in the chat? It's
You
like, what
think
the?
only 3 times?
Oh, I mean, I've only noticed 3 times. So I'm gonna
Hopefully
say
it's been more.
subscribe to Blue Baron, subscribe to Blue Baron, subscribe to Blue Baron. Come on, guys, give my boy some subs. I put him through hell trying to organize this stream. He deserves a whole lot of more subs. He deserves some more watch time. Settlers Lament, you're not the only one who can plug his content.
Yes, of course. But everyone should, of course, subscribe to me. I
Yeah.
hear that YouTube is considering banning all
Absolution, yes.
accounts that aren't subscribed to Settlers Lament. That seems kind of weird, but it's better subscribe just in case.
Oh, come on, like Blue Baron, can you do something better? Come on, dude.
Let's see. Your country needs you. Subscribe to the Blue Baron.
Yeah, there we go. Rule Britannia, guys. Subscribe to Settlers Lament. Subscribe to Blue Baron. Thanks for watching.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.